Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 128, Immigrants, Princes, and High Officials. There was a pall over the house, despite the visiting royal retinue creating something of a stir. While craftspeople were still hard at work repairing damage from the lightning strike only a few months earlier, that wasn't the reason for the low spirits. Rather, the house was worried for their patriarch, the Naidaijin Nakatomi no Kamatari. He had fallen ill, and despite all the pleas to the kami and the Buddhas, seemed the end might be near. And so even the sovereign himself had come. Kamatari was not just a loyal official, but a close friend of the sovereign, someone who had been there since the beginning. And so we can imagine how Naka no Oe felt. He may have been the sovereign of Yamato, but he was still a human being, visiting his friend of some 30 or so years, knowing that for all the power that he held, there was nothing he could do against the ravages of time and disease. The year is 668. Naka no Oe has moved the capital to Otsu on the banks of Lake Biwa, and has formally assumed the throne. This episode, we are going to cover the last several years of Naka no Oe's reign. In contrast to last week's dive into Yamato science, this week is going to be a bit of a grab bag, looking at what was going on in Yamato and talking about what was recorded in the Chronicles. And for the most part, the entries for the rest of the year 668 are fairly normal, yet there are some oddities. For instance, in the fourth month, we're told that Baekje sent Mitosapu and others to offer tribute. At any other time, that would be just a normal thing, a kingdom sending tribute or gifts. Except, at this point in history, Baekje was about as going a concern as a parrot in a Monty Python sketch. So if the kingdom of Baekje was no longer a thing, who was it that was sending the tribute? Most likely, it was the Baekje communities in exile living in the archipelago. Remember how many of them had been settled around Biwa, and in 666, 2,000 Baekje people were settled somewhere in the east. These immigrants were still being supported by the Yamato government, who were basically subsidizing their settlement for the first 3 years, during which time they would be expected to make it into something a bit more permanent. Based on the way the Chronicles talk about it, these early Baekje communities sound like they were maintaining a kind of kingdom in exile. With many immigrants from Baekje living together in proximity, they were likely keeping their own groups with their own language and traditions, at least for now. It would be interesting to know if there were specific Baekje settlements that have been identified through the archaeological record. That said, we definitely see Baekje's mark on the archipelago. Physically, there are Baekje-style castles and various temples following Baekje-style layouts. Of course, there were also continental building styles, but some of that was shared across multiple cultures at this point, and one should consider how much Baekje influence might have been found in things that we later see as just Japanese. Additionally, Baekje nobles were involved in the court, often given court rank based in part on their rank in Baekje, though it wasn't quite equivalent. Still, in time, some of the Japanese nobles would trace their lineages back to Baekje nobles and princes. Speaking of princes and Baekje, on the 5th day of the 5th month of 668, a day that would come to be known as Ayame no Hi or Tango no Sekku, one of the major days of court ceremony, Naka no Oe went out hunting on the moor of Kamafu, known today as Gamo district near Kanzaki, where 400 Baekje people had been settled. He was out there with the crown prince, his younger brother, aka Prince Oama, and all the other princes and ministers, a grand outing. A month later, however, tragedy struck. One Prince Ise and his younger brother died on consecutive days. While this was undoubtedly a blow to the court, the interesting thing for our purposes, which also highlights the challenge of interpreting the Chronicles, is that we aren't exactly sure who this is referring to. It's not the first time we've seen the title. We first see a Prince Ise show up around 650 during the presentation of the white pheasant that ushered in the Hakuho era, but we later see that individual had passed away in 661. We also see the name show up less than 20 years later in the Chronicles for another prince, so this can't be the same. So, I would think this is clearly a position or title for a prince, but it isn't clear if it was passed down or inherited or how someone came to be known as Prince Issei. One possibility is that Prince Issei or Prince of Issei was a title for one of the royal sons. At this point in the narrative, Naka no Oe had 3 sons. Prince Takeru had passed away at the age of 8, but he also had Prince Kawajima, Prince Shiki, and Prince Iga, aka Prince Otomo, all sons of palace women. We know, though, that these princes show up later, so I don't think the so-called Prince of Issei was one of them. Perhaps he was from another line? Now, the term prince might also refer to something other than a royal son. You see, English translators have often been somewhat cavalier with the way we tend to render titles. The English term prince, for instance, has been used for hiko, miko, or o, which was probably pronounced miko in many of these cases. And in English, we often think of prince as the son of a king, but prince can also be an independent ruler of a principality or may just refer to a person with power in a monarchic state. Even the term king is not unambiguous. Early European accounts of Japan during the Warring States period often refer to the various daimyo as kings, given the often absolute dominion with which they apparently ruled their particular domains. Now, at this time, the term miko, also pronounced oji or koshi or even sume miko, seems rather unambiguously to refer to a royal prince, that is, from the lineage of the sovereign, of one of the sovereigns. The term o, which also seems to be read as miko in some cases, well, it's also a term for king and probably more broadly fits the concept of a prince as a ruler. However, in this case, it seems to be equal to the term miko and may have been used almost interchangeably for a time, though later it would be used to refer to members of princely rank who were not directly related to a reigning sovereign, the grandchildren and so forth of royal princes who did not go on to inherit. In this case, I think the best we can say for certain is that Prince Issei, or the Prince of Issei, was someone important enough to be included in the Chronicles, but who he was exactly will remain a mystery for now. The following month, the 7th month, was chock full of activities. First of all, Goguryeo sent envoys by way of Koshi, meaning they landed on the Japan seaside probably around Tsuruga. While this may have just been closer, I suspect it meant that they avoided any Tang entanglements traveling through the Bohai Sea. They did run into a spot of trouble, however, as the winds and waves prevented their return. Koshi also shows up as presenting some strange gifts to the court: burning earth and burning water. There's some thought that this may be something like coal or natural oil deposits. We're also told that in this month, Kurikuma was appointed the governor of Tsukushi. Now, Kurikuma no O appears to have been the grandson, or possibly great-grandson, of the sovereign Nunakura, aka Biratsu Tennou. The position Kurikuma was given was important, of course, overseeing the Dazai, which meant overseeing anyone traveling to the archipelago from the continent. This would be a relatively short-lived appointment, at least this time. He would be reappointed about 3 years later, which would prove important as he would be governor there during some particularly momentous events. Stories appear to have continued about him in the Nagasaki region, and various families trace their lineage back to him. Also in that same month, we are told that Omi, home of the new capital, practiced military exercises, likely in preparation in case of a future Tang or Shilla invasion. Recall how we discussed back in episode 126 how the choice of Omi as a capital site might have been related to its defensibility in the event of such an invasion from the mainland. At the same time, that is the same month that Kurikuma was appointed, the court also entertained emishi envoys, and the toneri by royal command held banquets in various places. There's also mention of a shore pavilion, presumably at Lake Biwa, where fish of various kinds came covering the water. Interestingly enough, there is another story of a shore pavilion, likely the same one, in the Fujiwara family record, the Toshi Kaden. We are told that Prince Oama, Naka no Oe's younger brother, spiked a large spear through a plank of wood in some kind of feat of strength. This apparently shocked Naka no Oe, who saw it as a kind of threat, perhaps seeing that his 5 years younger brother was still hale and healthy. Granted, Naka no Oe was only in his 40s, but his brother, Oama, was in his late 30s. We're also told that at this time, in 668, Naka no Oe was apparently not doing so well, with people actually wondering if he would be with them much longer. Apparently, running the government like this really took it out of you. The Toshi Kaden account seems rather surprising in that it claims Naka no Oe was so shocked by this proof of his brother's vitality that he wanted to have him put to death, suggesting to me that he felt Oama might be a threat to him and his rule. Ultimately, though, he was talked out of this by his old friend Nakatomi no Kamatari, the one whom he had plotted with to overthrow the Soga and whose relationship was initiated by an interaction on the Kimari field, as we discussed back in episode 106. Speaking of whom, Nakatomi no Kamatari was still Naijin or Naidaijin, the inner or interior minister, and so quite prominent in the administration. In the 9th month, as a Shilla envoy was visiting the court, Kamatari sent Buddhist priests Hoben and Shinpitsu to present a ship to the prime minister of Shilla, which was given to the Shilla envoy and his companions, and 3 days later, Fusei no Omi no Mimimaro was sent with a ship meant for the king of Shilla as well. This incident is also recounted in the Toshi Kaden. In this case, it says that the people, hearing about the gifts to Shilla, were actually quite upset. After all, it does stand to reason Yamato was still smarting from their defeat at the hands of the Tang and Shilla forces, and building up defenses in case of an attack. They'd also taken in a number of Baekje nobles and families who may have also had some influence on the court. We're told that Kamatari himself excused all of this by stating that all under heaven must be the sovereign's land. The guests within its borders must be the sovereign's servants. In this case, all under heaven, or tenka, is a common phrase used to describe the monarch's sovereignty over everything in the land. And so while Shilla envoys were in Yamato as guests, they also fell under similar rules and as such were considered, at least by Yamato, as the sovereign's servants and thus worthy of gifts. The Shilla envoys stayed for over a month. They finally departed by the 11th month of 668, carrying even more gifts, including silk and leather for the king and various private gifts for the ambassadors themselves. The court even sent Chimori no Maro and Kishi no Oshibi back with the envoy as Yamato envoys to the Shilla court. This all tells us that just as the Tang were working to woo Yamato, Shilla was likely doing so as well. And while Yamato might still begrudge the destruction of Baekje, they also had to face the political reality that Baekje was probably not going to be reinstated again, especially not while the Tang government was occupying the peninsula. So making nice with both Tang and Shilla was prudent, if nothing else. Furthermore, though they had been visited by Goguryeo envoys earlier that year, Yamato may have had some inkling that Goguryeo was not in the most powerful position. Ever since the death of Yon Gesomun, the Goguryeo court had been involved in infighting, as well as fighting their external enemies. One of Gesomun's sons had been exiled and had gone over to the Tang, no doubt providing intelligence as well as some amount of legitimacy. What they may not have known was that as Yamato was hosting the Shilla envoys, a new assault by the Tang-Shilla alliance was advancing on Pyongyang and setting siege to the city. The Nihon Shoki records that in the 10th month of 668, Duke Ying, the Tang commander-in-chief, destroyed Goguryeo. This would dramatically change the international political landscape. Tang and Shilla had been triumphant, Yamato's allies on the peninsula had been defeated, and what we know as the Three Kingdoms period of the Korean peninsula was now over. However, the situation was still fluid. The peninsula was not exactly unified by any sense of the imagination. The Tang Empire had their strategic positions from which they controlled parts of the peninsula and from which they had been supplying the war effort against Goguryeo. They also likely had to occupy areas to ensure that nobody rose up and tried to reconstitute the defeated kingdoms. In fact, there would be continued attempts to revive Goguryeo, as might be indicated in the name we use for this area of the world. By the 5th century, the country was actually using the name Goguryeo, a shortened form of Goguryeo, but we continue to refer to it as Goguryeo to distinguish it from the country of the same name that would be established in 918, laying claim to that ancient Goguryeo identity. A bit of spoilers, but Goryeo is where we would eventually get the name that we know the region by today, Korea. In Nihon Shoki, it is referred to as Gauri. But none of that could have been known at the time. Instead, there was no doubt some exuberance on the side of both Shilla and Tang, but that would settle into something of unease. With Baekje and Goguryeo destroyed, Shilla may have thought that Tang would leave, allowing them to solidify their hold and manage those territories as an ally of the great Tang Empire. If this is what they thought, though, I'm not sure they had exactly run it by the Tang Empire just yet. In the Yamato court, there appear to have been separate factions, a pro-Tang faction and also a pro-Shilla faction. We have to assume, based on the actions in the record at this time, that this was probably an ongoing debate. The last thing I'll note for the year 668 is attempted theft. The Buddhist priest Dogyo stole Kusanagi, the famous sword forming part of the imperial regalia, and escaped with it. Kusanagi, you may recall, was the royal sword. It was named Kusanagi, or grass cutter, because it is said that when Prince Yamato Takeru was subduing the eastern lands, he was surrounded in a field that had been set on fire, and he used Kusanagi to create firebreak by cutting down all of the grass around him. The sword was given to him by Yamato Hime, the Ise princess at the time, and his aunt, and it was thought to have been first found by the god Susanoo inside of the legendary Yamata no Orochi. We talked about all this in episodes 16, 34, and 35. Yamato Takeru left the sword in Owari, and it would eventually live there at Atsuta Jingu, aka Atsuta Shrine, its traditional home. Now, it isn't clear if Dogyo obtained the sword from Owari or if it was being kept in the capital at this time. It would have likely been brought out for Naka no Oe's coronation, but then it would probably have been returned to the shrine that was holding it. Dogyo tried to head to Shilla with his illicit goods, but wind and rain forced him to turn around. This is a fascinating story, and there's a lot to dive into here. So first off, let's point out that this is supposed to be a Buddhist priest. I mean, what the heck was going on that he was going around trying to run a heist on what are essentially the crown jewels of the Yamato crown? While the sword, mirror, and jewel were still somewhat questionable as the sole three regalia, they were clearly important. Now, we aren't given Dogyo's motives. We really don't even know enough about him. Was he anti-Yamato or anti-Naka no Oe? Was he actually a Buddhist priest of his own accord, or was he a priest because he was one of those who had been essentially conscripted into religious orders on behalf of some powerful noble? Was he a Buddhist who wanted to attack the hold of the kami? Was he pro-Shilla, perhaps even a Shilla descendant trying to help Shilla? Or was he just a thief who saw the sword, Kusanagi, as a valuable artifact that could be pawned outside of Yamato? That last possibility feels off to me. While we aren't exactly sure what Kusanagi looked like, based on everything we know, the sword itself wasn't necessarily blinged out in a way that would make it particularly notable on the continent. And if Dogyo and whoever his co-conspirators were just wanted to attack the Yamato government, why didn't he just dump Kusanagi in the sea somewhere? He could have destroyed it or otherwise gotten rid of it in a way that would have embarrassed the government. It seems most likely that this theft had something to do with pro-Shilla sentiment. For instance, if Shilla suddenly showed up with the sword, then I imagine that would have been some kind of diplomatic leverage over the Yamato court, as they could have held it hostage. In any case, the plan ultimately failed, though the Chronicles claim it was only because the winds were against him, which was likely seen as the kami themselves defending Yamato. With that, on to a new year. The start of 669, Prince Kurikuma, who we mentioned above, was recalled to the capital and Sogono Akae was appointed governor of Tsukushi. We mentioned Akae a couple of episodes back. He was involved in the broken armrest incident where Prince Arimo was plotting against Takarahime, aka Saimei Tennou, and Akae's daughter Hitachi no Iratsume was one of the formal wives of Naka no Oe, who would eventually give birth to the Princess Yamabe. Now Akae was given the position of governor of Tsukushi. This position is an interesting one throughout Japanese history. In many ways, it is a viceroy. The governor of Tsukushi has to effectively speak with the voice of the sovereign as the person responsible for overseeing any traffic to and from the continent. This was also likely a highly lucrative position, only handed out to trusted individuals. However, it also meant that you were outside of the politics of the court. Early on, that was probably less of a concern. At the time, court nobles were likely still concerned more with their traditional lands, which created their economic base, meaning that the court may have been the political center, but there was still plenty of ways to gain power in the archipelago, and it wasn't just through the court's good graces. Over time, as more and more power accrued to the central court government, that would change. Going out to manage a government outpost on the far end of the archipelago, let alone just going back to manage one's own estates, would be tantamount to exile. But for now, without a permanent city built up around the palace, I suspect that being away from the action in the capital wasn't quite as detrimental compared to the lucrative nature of a powerful position. Later, we'll see how that flips on its head, especially with the construction of capitals on the model of those like Chang'an. For now, new governor Sogano Akae was likely making the most of his position. And on that note, in the third month of 669, Tamna sent their Prince Kumaki with envoys and tribute. They would have come through Tsukushi, and Sogano Akae likely enjoyed some benefits as they were entertained while waiting for permission to travel the rest of the way to the Yamato capital. The Tamna embassy did not exactly linger at the court. They arrived on the 11th of the third month and left 1 week, that is 7 days later, on the 18th. Still, they left with a gift of seed grain made to the king of Tamna. On their way out, they likely would have again stopped in at Tsukushi for provisions and to ensure that all of their business was truly concluded before departing. A couple of months later, on the 5th day of the 5th month, we see another hunting party by Naka no Oe. This seems to have been part of the court ritual of the time for this ceremonial day. This time, it was on the plain of Yamashina. It was attended by his younger brother, Crown Prince Owama, as well as someone called Fujiwara no Naidaijin, and all of the ministers. Fujiwara no Naidaijin is no doubt Nakatomi no Kamatari. This is an interesting slip by the chroniclers, and I wonder if it gives us some insight into the source this record came from. Kamatari was still known as Nakatomi at this time, and was still the Naidaijin, so it is clear they are talking about him. But historically, his greatest reputation is as the father of the Fujiwara family, something we'll get to in time. That said, a lot of records in this period refer to him as Fujiwara. We've seen this previously because the records were being written later. They were often using a more common name for an individual, rather than the name, including title, that the individual actually would have borne at the time of the events in the record itself. This really isn't that different from the way we talk about the sovereigns using their posthumous names. Naka no Oe would not have been known as Tenji Tennou during his reign. That wouldn't be used until much later. And yet, many history books will, understandably, just use the name Tenji because it makes it clear who's being talked about. This hunting trip is not the only time we see the name Fujiwara creep into the chronicles a little earlier than is accurate. We are also told that only a little later the house of Fujiwara no Kamatari was struck by lightning. That wasn't the only tragedy waiting in the wings. Apparently, Kamatari was not doing so well, and on the 10th day of the 10th month, his friend and sovereign Naka no Oe showed up to pay his respects and see how he was doing. Ever since that fateful game of Kamari, Japanese kickball, the two had been fast friends. Together, they envisioned a new state, they overthrew the Soga, and changed the way that Japan even conceived of the idea of government, basing their new vision off of continental ideas of statehood, governance, and sovereignty. Now, however, Kamatari was gravely ill. What happens next is likely of questionable veracity, since it is unlikely that someone was there writing down the exact words that were exchanged, but the chronicles record a conversation between the sovereign and his ill friend, and the words that the chroniclers put in their mouths were more about the image that they wanted to project, but still. So according to them, Nakano-Oe praised his friend and asked if there was anything that he could do. Kamatari supposedly eschewed anything special for burial arrangements. He supposedly said, "While alive, I did no service for my country at war. Why then should I impose a heavy burden on it when I am dead?" Now, hard to know if he actually felt like that or not, or if the chroniclers were just likening him to Feng Yi of the Han Dynasty, the general of the Great Tree. This was a general that was so called because he would often find a tree to take time to himself. He likewise was renowned for his dislike of ostentation, much like Kamatari foregoing a fancy burial mound. 5 days later, Nakano-Oe sent Crown Prince Oama to Kamatari's house to confer on Kamatari the cap of Daishiki and the rank of Oomi. They also conferred on him and his family a new surname, Fujiwara, and so he became Fujiwara no Daijin, the Fujiwara Great Minister. And the next day he died. One source, known as the Nihon Seiki, said that he was 50 years old, but according to the Chronicles, there was an inscription on his tomb that stated he died at age 55. 3 days later, we're told that Nakano-Oe went to the house of the now late Fujiwara no Naidaijin and gave orders to Sogono Akae no Omi, declaring to him his gracious will and bestowing on him a golden incense burner. This is all somewhat odd because, as we were just talking about, Sogono Akae had been appointed governor of Tsukushi, though the Toshi Kaden claims that it was actually Sogono Toneri who was in Tsukushi, but then these could also be the same people just using different words. Why this happened right after Kamatari's death suggests to me that Sogono Akae may have had something to do with the arrangements for Kamatari's funeral or something similar. Now let's talk about this whole incident just a little more. There are many that think the Nihon Shoki has things a bit out of order and possibly on purpose. Specifically, it is quite likely that the name Fujiwara was actually granted after Kamatari's death and not on the day of, as it says here. He may even have been posthumously elevated. But since the Fujiwara family would go on to be quite powerful, the order of events and how they were recorded would have been very important in the 8th century. By naming Kamatari's line the Fujiwara, the court were effectively severing it from the rest of the Nakatomi. The Nakatomi family would continue to serve as court ritualists, but the Fujiwara family would go on to much bigger and better things. This change also likely meant that any inheritance of Kamatari's would go to his direct descendants, and that a brother or a cousin couldn't necessarily just take over as the head of the household. So it's very possible that this setting apart of the Fujiwara family immediately upon Kamatari's death is a later fiction encouraged by the rising Fujiwara themselves in an attempt to keep others from hanging on to their coattails, as it were. Also, a quick note about the idea that there was an inscription on Kamatari's tomb. This is actually remarkable because so far we have not actually found any such markers or tombstones on burials prior to this period. We assume that they would have been stone or wood markers that were put up by a mound to let you know something about the person who was buried there. Over time, most of these likely wore away, but it's interesting to think that the practice may have had older roots. The death of Kamatari wasn't the only tragedy that year. We are also told that in the 12th month there was a fire in the treasury, and that the temple of Ikaruga, known to us as Horyuji, the temple built by Shoto Taishi himself, was also burnt. It isn't said how bad, but only 3 months later in 670, another fire struck during a thunderstorm, and we're told that everything burned down. Nothing was left. That said, it does seem they may have been able to reuse some of the materials. And I say this because an analysis of the main pillar of the pagoda in the western compound of Horyuji suggests that the tree it came from was felled in 594. And I doubt they were just holding on to that in case something happened. The rest of 699 included some less dramatic events. For instance, in the 8th month, Nakano-Oe climbed to the top of Takayasu, where he took advice as to how to repair the castle there. The castle had been built only a couple of years earlier, but already needed repairs. However, the initial repair project had been abandoned because the labor costs were too much. The repairs were still needed, though, and they carried out the work 4 months later in the 12th month, and again in the second month of the following year. And then we're also told that stores of grain and salt were collected, presumably to stock the castle in case they had to withstand a siege. I suspect that the cost of repairing the castle was mostly that it was the 8th month, and the laborers for the work would have to be taken away from the fields. Remember, this was conscript or corvée labor. By the 12th month, I can only assume that those same laborers would have been free from their other duties, therefore imposing a much less harsh burden on the people. Speaking of costs, sometimes the Chronicles really make you wonder what was going through the mind of the writers, because they noted that the land tax of the home provinces was collected. Maybe this was the first time it had actually been instituted. I don't know. It just seems an odd thing to call out. They paid their taxes. Okay. There was also 700 more men from Baekje removed and settled in Kamafu, Gammo district in Omi. And there was a Shilla embassy in the 9th month, and at some point in the year, Kawachi no Atai no Kujira and others were sent to the Tang court. In response, an embassy from the Tang to Yamato brought 2,000 people with them, headed by Guo Wutsong, who I really hope was getting some kind of premier cruiser status for all of his trips. Following year, 700 started out with a great archery meeting arranged at the palace gate. I presume this to mean they had a contest. Archery at this time, and even for years to come, was prized more highly than even swordplay. After all, archery was used both in war and on the hunt. It is something that even the great sage Confucius suggested that people should practice. It is also helpful that they could always shoot at targets as a form of competition and entertainment. Later, on the 14th day of the first month, Naka no Oe promulgated new court ceremonial regulations and new laws about people giving way on the roads. This rule was that those of lower status should get out of the way of those of higher status. Funnily enough, in the description of Queen Himiko's Yamato back in the 3rd century, this was also called out as a feature of the country. It's possible that he was codifying a local tradition, or that tradition actually goes back to the continent, and that the Wei Chronicles were projecting such a rule onto the archipelago. I'm honestly not sure which is which, or perhaps they expanded the rules and traditions already in place. There were also new laws about prohibiting heedless slanders and foul falsehoods, which sounds great, but doesn't give you a lot to go on and what exactly it meant. May have just sounded good. The law and order theme continues in the following month. A census was taken, and robbers and vagabonds were suppressed. Naka no Oe also visited Kamao, where he had settled a large number of the Baekje people and inspected a site for a possible future palace. He also had castles built in Nagato and in Tsukushi along the route of any possible invasion from the Korean peninsula. In the 3rd month, we have evidence of the continued importance of kami worship, when they laid out places to practice kami worship close to Mii Mountain and distributed offerings of cloth. Nakatomi no Kane no Muraji pronounced the litany. Note that it is Nakatomi no Muraji, and as we mentioned, the Nakatomi would continue to be responsible for ceremonial litany, while the Imibe or Imbe family would be responsible for laying out the various offerings. Mi would seem to be the same location as Mi-dera, aka Onjoji, but Mi-dera wouldn't be founded for another couple of years. In the 9th month of 670, Azumi no Tsuratari, an accomplished ambassador by this point, traveled to Shilla. Tsuratari had been going on missions during the reign of Takarahime both to Baekje and to the lands across the western seas. While we don't know exactly what transpired, details like this can help us piece together something of the relative importance of the mission. In the last entry for 670, we are told that water mills were made to smelt iron. If you're wondering how that works, it may have been that the water wheel powered something like trip hammers. It would cause the hammers to raise up until it reached a point where it would fall. Not quite the equivalent of a modern power hammer, it still meant that fewer people were needed for the process, and they didn't have to stop just because their arms got tired. The following year, 671, got off to a grand start with a lot of momentous events mentioned in just the first month of the year. First off, on the second day of the first month, Soga no Akae, now back from his stint as Governor Tsukushi, and Kose no Hito advanced in front of the palace and offered their congratulations on the new year. 3 days later, on the fifth day, Nakatomi no Kane, the one who had provided the litany at Mii, made an announcement on kami matters. Then the court made official appointments. Soga no Akae was made the Sadaijin, or Prime Minister of the left, and Nakatomi no Kane was made Prime Minister of the right. Soga no Hatayasu, Kose no Hito, and Ki no Ushi were all made Daibu, or High Ministers. And on top of this, Naka no Oe's own son, Prince Otomo, was appointed as Dajo Daijin. Now, Dajo Daijin is a new position that we haven't seen yet, and it is one of those positions that would only show up on occasion. It is effectively a prime minister. They were considered superior to both the ministers of the left and the right, but didn't exactly have their own particular portfolio. The ministers of the left and right each had ministries under them, and they were responsible for managing those. These were the ministries that made up the Daijo Kan, or the Council of State. The Daijo Daijin, or Dajo Daijin, was basically the preeminent position overseeing that very council. I suspect that the Dajo Daijin seems to have been the evolution of the Naidaijin, but on steroids. Nakatomi no Kamatari had administered things as Naidaijin from within the royal household, but he was also just a common noble, not necessarily of royal birth. The Dajo Daijin, on the other hand, was explicitly at the head of the state. Of course, Prince Otomo was the son of Naka no Oe himself, and the fact that he was only 23 years old and now put in a place of prominence over other ministers, who were quite likely his senior, is remarkable to say the least. I wonder how much he was actually expected to do and how much it was largely a ceremonial position, but it nonetheless placed Otomo just below his uncle, Crown Prince Oama, in the overall power structure at the court. Speaking of which, following the new appointments on the 6th day of the year, Crown Prince Oama promulgated regulations on behalf of his brother, Naka no Oe. There was also a general amnesty declared, and the ceremonial and names of the cap ranks were described in what the Chronicles call the Shin Ritsuryo, the new laws. Towards the end of the first month, there were 2 embassies, both from now defunct kingdoms. The first was from Goguryeo, who reportedly sent someone named Karu and others with tribute on the 9th day. And then 4 days later, Liu Jianwan, the Tang general for Baekje, sent Li Shouchen and others to present a memorial. Not sure if the Goguryeo envoys were from a government in exile or from a subjugated kingdom under Tang and Shilla domination. The Tang general in Baekje was a little more transparent. That said, that same month, we are also told that more than 50 Baekje nobles were given Yamato court rank, perhaps indicating that they were being incorporated into the Yamato court and eventually society as a whole. That said, the remains of the Baekje court sent Daegu Yongshon and others with tribute the following month. Which, I wonder if that was a bit awkward with them there and also the embassy from Liu Jianwan, but who knows. This is also the year that Naka no Oe is said to have placed the clepsydra, or water clock, in a new pavilion. We talked about this significance last episode. We are also told that on the 3rd day of the 3rd month, Kibuni no Honjitsu presented a water level, a Mizu Hakari. This would seem to be what it sounds like, a way of making sure that a surface is level using water. There's also mention of the province of Hitachi presenting as tribute one Nakatomi Bay no Wakako. Now, Wakako was only 16 years old, and yet we are told he was only 1.5 feet in height, 1 shaku 6 sun, more appropriately. Assuming modern conversions, that would have put him approximately the same height as Chandra Dangi of Nepal, who passed away in 2015, but who held the Guinness World Record for the world's shortest person at 21.5 inches, or 54 centimeters in height. So, I guess it isn't impossible. The fact that he's called Nakatomi Bay suggests that he was part of a family or bay group that served or supported the Nakatomi court ritualists. Unfortunately, he was probably seen more as an oddity than anything else at the time. Still, how many people from that time are not remembered at all in any extant record? And yet here we have his name, Nakatomi no Wakako, which is more than most got. In the following month, we are also told that Tsukushi reported a deer that had been born, with 8 legs. Fortunately, the poor thing died immediately, which too often the case. And then the 5th day of the 5th month rolled around again. This year there was no hunting, but instead Naka-no-Oe occupied the little western palace, and the crown prince and all of his ministers attended him. We are told that 2 rustic dances were performed, presumably meaning dances of some local culture rather than those conforming to the art standards passed down from the continent. As noted earlier, this day would be one of the primary ceremony days of the later court. The following month, we are told there was an announcement in regards to military measures requested by the messengers from the 3 departments of Baekje, and later the Baekje nobles sent Ye Chincha and others to bring tribute. Once again, what exactly this means isn't clear, but it is interesting to note that there were 3 departments of Baekje. It's unclear if this was considered part of the court or if this was Baekje court in exile managing their own affairs as a guest in Yamato. Maybe it refers to 3 different areas where they had settled Baekje people. I don't know. It's also interesting that they seem to have been traveling to the Yamato court while Li Shou-chen and his envoys were still there. Remember, they had been sent by the Tang general overseeing Baekje. So, again, another likely awkward meeting. But we are told that they all took their departure together on the 11th day of the 7th month. That leaves me wondering. Does that mean they left with the Tang envoy? Was the Tang inviting some of them to come back? Or was it just that they literally left the court on the same day and went different directions? The same month, Prince Kurikuma was once more made governor of Tsukushi. Possibly made governor for the first time, depending on whether or not you think the Chronicles are accurate, or that they pulled the same event twice from different sources that just had different years. We are also told that Shilla envoys with gifts that included a water buffalo and a copper pheasant for the sovereign arrived. The 8th month of the year, we hear that Karu of Goguryeo and his people, well, they finally took their leave after a 7-month-long visit. Court also entertained the emishi, and then 2 months later, Shilla sent Kim Mammol and others with more tribute, but this envoy likely found a different feeling at court. And that is because on the 18th day of the 8th month, the sovereign of Yamato, Naka-no-Oe, took to his bed, ill. There was a ceremony to open the eyes of 100 Buddhas in the interior of the palace, and Naka-no-Oe sent messengers to offer to the giant Buddha of Hokoji a kesa, a golden begging bowl, an ivory tusk, aloes wood, sandalwood, and various objects of value. But despite any spiritual merit that may have accrued, it didn't seem to work. Naka-no-Oe's illness continued to grow more serious. He would continue to struggle for another 2 months until, on the 3rd day of the 12th month, Naka-no-Oe, aka Tenji Tennou, sovereign of Yamato, passed away. For all that we should be careful to avoid the great man theory of history, it is nonetheless hard to deny that Naka-no-Oe had an incredible impact on the country in his days. From start to finish, while one could argue many of the reforms were simply a matter of time as the archipelago absorbed more and more ideas from across the straits, Naka-no-Oe found himself in the middle of those reforms. The Yamato state would never be the same, and he oversaw the birth of the Ritsuyo state, a new state nominally based on laws and rules rather than just tradition. It may not be entirely clear, but he also helped inculcate a new sense of the power of the sovereign and of the state, introducing new cultural imaginaries. Yamato's reach wasn't just vague boasting, but by instituting the bureaucratic state, they were able to actually expand the reach of the court farther than any time before. And through those changes, Naka-no-Oe had, in one way or another, been standing at the tiller. Now, he was gone, as were so many of his co-conspirators in this national project. Which leaves us wondering, what comes next? Well, We'll get to that, but not right now. For now, let us close this episode with Naka no Oe's own end. From here, we can get into the power struggles that followed, culminating in an incident known as the Jinshin no Ran, the Jinshin War. But until then, thank you once again for listening and for all of your support. If you like what we're doing, please tell your friends and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we have information about how you can donate on Patreon or through our coffee site, ko-fi.com/Sengoku Daimyo, or find links over at our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we will have some more discussion on topics from this episode. Also, feel free to reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page. You can also email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. Thank you also to Ellen for their work editing the podcast. And that's all for now. Thank you again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.